So I'd like to welcome you all to the UBC Learning Circle hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I'd first like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people who we are currently hosting this session from. I'd also like to thank the First Nations Health Authority who have generously funded the Learning Circle. And also remind people that the Learning Circle is a place of learning and sharing, and sometimes the topics can be emotionally sensitive or triggering, and just to ensure that if you need to talk to someone today, that you talk to a friend or a trusted elder or a counselor, and just make sure you're looking after yourself today. So I want to introduce myself. I'm Melanie Rivers. I'm from the Squamish Nation. And my Statlium name is Mwamowit, which means medicine. And I'm the new education coordinator for the Learning Circle. Very excited to be here. And the Learning Circle is a weekly webinar format to share information around health and well-being for First Nations, Indigenous people, and with a focus on creating opportunities for people who work in health with First Nations and Indigenous people. So before I introduce Harlan, I'll just overview how the session will go. Harlan has a PowerPoint presentation, which you should be able to see on your screen. So he's going to go through the presentation, and then if you have questions, we'll have a discussion and question period at the end. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat box now if you'd like. And so I'm going to welcome Harlan and read you a little bit about him. So Harlan is First Nations Cree. He works with and for the Two-Spirit community locally, nationally, and internationally. Currently, Harlan is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia and is an educator at the BC Centre for Disease Control's Chima program. Harlan is also the managing editor of the Two-Spirit Journal, an interactive multi-platform Two-Spirit media news site. Before moving to Vancouver from New York City, Harlan was co-founder and former director of the Northeast Two-Spirit Society and the principal Two-Spirit consultant to USA Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Tribal Training and Technical Assistance Center. In August 2014, Harlan was appointed to the United States Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, where he works to provide advice. Worked. I wondered that. Otherwise you'd be traveling a lot. Worked to provide advice, information, and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the White House. And in the spring of 2013, Harlan was appointed to be an American representative to the International Indigenous Peoples Working Group of HIV/AIDS. Closer to home, Harlan is a board member of the Community, the home for Vancouver's LGBT, queer, and Two-Spirit community, and was just appointed by the City of Vancouver to be a trustee for the Vancouver Public Library. So, welcome, Harlan.
Thank you so much.
Yes, really pleased to have you here. So Harlan's going to be talking about pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, and so I'll turn it over to Harlan to share his presentation.
Great, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, and also virtually with everyone that is also on the webinars and the telephone conference call. I had to say worked because I was just fired by Trump. He dismissed the entire Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. I was twice appointed by President Obama, and what he did was, we knew it was probably coming down the pipeline that we were all going to be fired. So today I'm going to be talking, are you PrEPared? PrEP basics and knowledge disseminations. Again, Tanzai, Neto Chimchek Harlan e Waka no Mani, Niha Neha Niha Ayakwe. Greetings, my relatives. My English name is Harlan Pruden. My native name or Indian name, I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation and they honored me with the name Waka no Mani. Waka being spirit, good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can suck up a lot of space and do nothing. So there's a responsibility of how do I want to show up, and so I try to carry myself in the best way to bring honor for my people and also my communities. Nom is two, and Mani is a sacred journey, and so I'm in the process of getting that translated into Cree, and I said that I am First Nations Cree. Niha Nehiao. My mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve, my father is from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve, two different reservations, Treaty 6 territory in northeastern Alberta. And I also said that I am Two-Spirit, and I am a big Two-Spirit community organizer, and so honored and pleasure, just incredibly honored to work with and for my Two-Spirit community. So, and before I go any further, I also would like to acknowledge that I work, play, and live on the traditional, ancestral, as well as unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations people. This land acknowledgement is not some sort of perfunctory statement. It is me acknowledging the fact that I am a guest, and I've gone through the protocols to ask to be a guest on their territory. And so I don't just let that roll off my tongue. Mm-hmm. For me, is that it is me acknowledging that I am not of this territory and I am a guest on their territory. I kind of liken it to if I were to walk into your house and not acknowledge that I'm in your house. Mm-hmm. And if we carry that same analogy, I would start telling you how and when to clean your own home. So I take this to heart. Yes. The land acknowledgement is something that I bring and I try to invoke and try to live as a guest on this territory. So thank you so much to all of the organizers and the support for this time to talk about PrEP. For disclosures, as of today, I have no conflicts of interest to declare, but I do have a statement of relationship. And my relationships is with the First Nations and Inuit people, as well as the Métis people here in BC. And if I drill down, it is my relationships that I am accountable to those people, and that is also inclusive of my Two-Spirit people and my Two-Spirit brothers and sisters. So the objectives are a broad overview of what we'll be talking about is from a First Nations and Inuit people's lens or frame. We'll be talking about what is PrEP, who is PrEP for, accessing publicly funded PrEP here in BC and in the rest of Canada, and then some resources for people that are on the call if they want to drill down and to get more information. I am currently an educator with the Chima team at the BC Center for Disease Control, and these are my colleagues from Felicia, Jessica, Michael, Lynette, myself, and Amanda Porter, who is currently on a maternity leave because she has a new baby. Oh. So happy about that. Chima provides innovative and culturally appropriate HIV, hepatitis, STI, STBBI education, as well as resources and wise practice models for and with Aboriginal communities here in BC. This is accomplished with our following programs: Around the Kitchen Table, that's been around for like 14 years, and it's our women's program. We also have a newly launched or piloting, and it's 1 year in its inception, is Encouraging Strong Paths, and it's built off of the Around the Kitchen Table model, and it is our men's health program. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. So exciting. We're in the process of developing a framework for our Two-Spirit program, which will be looking at the embedment of Two-Spirit conversations in communities, both within Around the Kitchen Table as well as within Encouraging Strong Paths, and a standalone program. And then finally, it is creating community-relevant resources, and I wish that I had more time to share those incredible resources that we provide. So, Chima, the Chima tree, is we went through a strategic planning process, our yearly or annual strategic planning process, and what we came up with was the Chima tree, which serves as our theoretical understanding of growing and nurturing conversations and educations within our community. The various post-its on the tree provide a visible roadmap to guide our current workload. And so what we're trying to do is to move the post-its up from the roots to the trunk to support that work, to the actual out to the branches where the fruit is bared, and our work comes to fruition. The clouds are aspirational, but at the same time, you'll see it says bring ATKT, around the kitchen table, ESP, and Two-Spirit programming together. That actually, in our next inception, will be a post-it and will be brought down as it starts growing up. And so the aspirational work is already becoming real. So here is an HIV prevention toolkit. And it's broken down into two different major areas. There's medical, and medical is through medical interventions. And then there's behavior and physical barriers, or things that you can actually do to protect yourself. And so within the physical barriers, it's clean syringe, condoms and other barrier models, harm reduction, education, as well as treatment programs. Medical is both treatment as prevention, microbicides, other STI diagnosis and treatment, PEP, NPEP, PrEP, and then prevention to mother and child transmission. And that is all accomplished through biomedical interventions. Oh, and the last one way up there, I put it up above the handle, vaccines and the need for a vaccine. Currently there is not a vaccine available, but there are trials that are happening, so we haven't given up on that dream. So this is a medicine wheel, and what I've done is taken the medicine wheel and put the 4 different modalities of protection, and that a comprehensive HIV strategy includes multiple approaches instead of just 1 or 2 approaches. We have to approach this as a holistic conversation, both from physical barriers, behavior health, pills, and other medical devices that can help you protect yourself from HIV. And for the medicine wheel, it is so that we take a balanced approach, not just one approach, but it has to be a combination of all of these approaches to then really protect yourself. So again, medicines such as Truvada, and other microbicides that are coming down the pipeline. Medical devices and medical procedures. A good example of that is testing, knowing your status, right? So that you can take and protect yourself because you know what your status is. Physical barriers being condoms, dental dams, and other prophylaxis, as well as behavioral approaches, and that is making sure that we're walking in a good way. So there, again, to reiterate, there is no one HIV prevention approach that will be acceptable to all people. And so we have 4 big categories. Some of those categories are going to resonate stronger with individuals, but it can be a combination approach. The best option for one person may not be the best option for others. So people who are no longer living a life of recovery or are taking harm reduction matters, that is their path, right? But that's for someone who doesn't have a problem with alcohol and or drugs, that behavioral intervention is not going to be resonant with them. It may be a combination of physical barriers like condoms and Truvada, and also testing. And so we just have to always take a holistic approach to this conversation. And finally, research is critical to the development to test new prevention options and strategies that offer people more choices. Often for research is that the First Nation, for Aboriginal community members, is that we often don't enter into research studies. And if our community is not in those studies and not are participating, we actually don't know the efficacy or how effective that strategy will be because our community is not participating in those research. So I think it is vitally important to get First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people enrolled into clinical trials as well as other interventions so that we know how effective those interventions will be within our community. So our talk, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew the difference between, and I'm sure that you all know the difference between non-occupational post-exposure prophylaxis versus pre-exposure prophylaxis. So if you read the chart or the visual image, starting on the bottom, PrEP is a treatment after exposure. So say you go out on Friday night, you've had too much to drink, or some other in your judgment is impaired, or the condom breaks. Within a 72-hour period, if you make it to a clinic or an emergency room, is that you can go on pre-exposure prophylaxis. 24 hours or less is better than 48, and 72 hours after exposure the efficacy is not as strong as it was for 24 hours. And so if you're exposed to HIV, being stuck with a needle, seek medical attention as soon as you can, and to go on a 30-day regimen. And if you are on the pre-exposure, basically the HIV is wiped from your system. It doesn't hook to your system. And then from the top is pre-exposure, which we will be talking about. It is a treatment before exposure, and so it's a daily oral pill right now, the intervention that we'll be talking about, that you can take. So we will be drilling down and talking more about PrEP in a little bit. Again, going back to the toolkit, although there are all of these other interventions, we are going to narrow our focus on pre-exposure prophylaxis, or known as PrEP. So PrEP prevention approach or strategy is focused on people who currently do not have HIV, but may be at risk to exposure to HIV either through sexual contact and or injection drug use. With PrEP, people who do not have HIV receive a prescription for a medication. The medication is a blue oval pill about this big that is taken once a day. And the medication shows that it will see, I say may because I have to, but may lower your risk. It's like 98% the efficacy of this intervention. Lower their risk of HIV transmission if they are exposed to HIV. Now, how basically PrEP works is, again, you take this pill once a day, and take it in the morning or the evening, and if you are exposed to HIV, it is basically voided from your system. So let's say you go out on that same Friday night, you've had too much to drink, the heat of the moment, the condoms were way on the other side of the room, and you have condomless sex and you're exposed. If you're on Truvada, it's basically wiped from your system. Or you get the condom and the condom breaks during sex, which happens, again, and you're exposed to HIV, the HIV is voided from the system. The same goes for injection drug use if you have used or using a needle that has HIV in it. So PrEP progress in Canada in 2006, the co-formulation, I'm not going to pronounce it, under the trade name Truvada, received its notice of compliance from Health Canada as a treatment for HIV-1 infections. In 2007, Truvada is listed as a non-insured health benefits for treatment, and the non-insured health benefits provides coverage to eligible residents in Canada who are either First Nations, Inuit, and an infant less than 1 year old whose parents are a registered First Nations person or from a recognized Inuk nations and or people. In BC, First Nations Health Authority began receiving transfer payments to Health Canada for their non-insured health benefits on July 2nd, 2013. Truvada as a treatment was covered from that day going forward for First Nations Health Authority for BC's First Nations communities. In February 6, 2016, Health Canada issued another notice of compliance for Truvada. In combination with safer sex practices, taking a multimodality approach for prevention, I should have highlighted that word, indication of pre-exposure prophylaxis to reduce the risk of sexually acquired HIV-1 infections in HIV-negative adults at risk. First Nations Health Authority followed Health Canada and began to cover PrEP at that time. So for 2 years, 7 days, Truvada and the generic equivalent has been a covered benefit here in BC for First Nations and Inuit people. For HIV prevention, using Truvada and or the generic equivalent, and those are the two formularies right there. Truvada is approved for daily use for HIV prevention as well as a treatment strategy. The treatment is still available, but it is now prevention and approved as a prevention strategy. Truvada and or the generic equivalent must be taken consistently on a daily basis to be effective as PrEP. PrEP and pre-exposure prophylaxis, Truvada and or the generic equivalent is not effective in preventing other STBBIs, including syphilis, gonorrhea, or hepatitis. For this, PrEP for Truvada is narrowly contextualized within HIV prevention. It does not prevent you. And that's where the condoms come in for syphilis, gonorrhea, as well as hepatitis, and making sure that you don't have exposure to other sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections. It is recommended that people who are prescribed PrEP to be used in combination of prevention strategies that includes behavior health interventions and other strategies from the medicine wheel, if you think back to the earlier slide that we had talked about. How PrEP works is basically Truvada and or the generic equivalent is an antiviral medication, an ARV, that protects HIV negative people from acquiring HIV if they are exposed to the virus. Again, if the condom breaks, or you choose to have sex without a condom, or your judgment is impaired. And the same goes for needles. I want to make sure that syringes are within that conversation. And the ARTs block the action of the protein that HIV needs to infect the body or become a host for the body, and it is basically voided from your system. Who should be using Truvada or the generic equivalent for HIV prevention? Well, male assigned, two-spirit and or native men who are having sex with men. High risk, and those are the major categories of people who are contracting HIV according to the latest surveillance data. Trans women, native and or not, who are having sex with men, again, are another target population. And heterosexual couples, and I can also say same-sex couples where one partner is HIV positive or has HIV and the other doesn't. And what we would say is that there's serodiscordant, sero being a blood, discordant being plus and minus or positive and negative. And people who inject drugs. And so I took the guidance, both the Canadian guidance as well as the BC guidance, and I harmonized it and I came up with this list for the 4 major target groups who are negative, as this is a viable intervention that is available for them. Accessing Truvada here in BC. Requirements for use is that the individual must be HIV negative, proven by testing prior to starting the use. And it cannot be the rapid HIV. This has to be the full 4th generation HIV AGAB test. And so where there's a blood pull, that blood work is then sent to a lab, the BC CDC's lab, and it takes about 5 to 10 days for those results. I remember when back in the 80s, when I would go get tested, that was like the longest week ever of like waiting to get your results. For this, it is waiting for 5 to 10 days to get those results. So you must be negative prior to using Truvada. Other baseline blood work requires hepatitis B surface antigen. Now, there is guidance both here in BC and the federal guidance that if you have hepatitis B, it doesn't rule you out from using Truvada. It's just that there is extra precaution and extra screening that must go into using Truvada as an intervention if you have hepatitis B. You have to look at creatinine and other renal and kidney functions to make sure that those are okay, because that's where the medication is being processed. And so if you have good creatinine and good renal and kidney functions, then what you become and you're HIV negative, you become a good candidate for this intervention. And there is ongoing testing, so every 3 months before you get a refill, you have to get another set of blood work so that they monitor your creatinine, your liver functions, and also you have to be that negative test once again. And if those all come back okay, then you get your script and you get another 90 days. So every 3 months you have to do this. For First Nations, accessing Truvada and or the generic equivalent here in BC, for First Nations and Inuit people here in BC, as well as in the rest of Canada, this is the process that holds true today. You go to the doctor, and on your first appointment or doctor, your baseline blood work is ordered. Well, first of all, you have a conversation with your provider, and hopefully your provider knows that Truvada has existed. You can contact the BC Centre of Excellence and ask for a list of approved providers that they have already done advanced work so that they know of Truvada. Or you take your chances, go to your doctor, say, hey doctor, I'd like to have Truvada. The doctor goes, okay, let's get some blood work. After that blood work comes back, and the results again can take up to 5 days because it's that Gen 4 HIV test. Then you come back and you, based on the review of the baseline blood work, and if everything comes back cool, Truvada is prescribed. You take that prescription and you go to any pharmacy and have it filled here in BC at no cost. And I will provide I didn't include it on this slide, but I will be sending out a follow-up email with a 1-800 number for First Nations Health Authority if you have any questions about coverage or accessing Truvada if you're First Nations. If you're Inuit, if you go to the the BC CDC's website and their Smart Sex resource, there's a 1-800 number for Health Canada if you're Inuit and you want to have any questions about accessing PrEP. Now, for general population here in BC, and that includes our Métis people. So Inuit people receive their health care through Health Canada and the non-insured health benefits here in BC. If you're First Nations, you receive health care through the First Nations Health Authority. For Métis and everyone else, it's through MSP or private or work, but usually through MSP. And their process is a little bit more complex, and so I just wanted to walk through to make sure that everyone knows. This is not for First Nations and Inuit people. This is for general population and Métis. So you go to your doctor and you have your first point, PrEP is requested and the baseline blood work ordered. Then on your second appointment, the baseline blood work is reviewed, and if it comes back everything cool, the prescriber then has to fill out a Centre of Excellence HIV form, and in that form they have to do a HERE assessment, which is 6 questions documenting that you are at risk. So they ask, how many times have you had anal receptive sex, or you were the bottom with men in the last 6 months? How many times have you had anal insertive sex without a condom with someone who's HIV positive? And how many, it asks how many men have you slept with in the last 6 months, and again, it's to calculate risk. And then if you have syphilis or syphilis diagnosis, and then there's something else around some sort of anal infection, or if you are in a serodiscordant couple, and so you have to document need. And then there are other questions that have to be asked. So you fill out that form, you fax it to the BC Centre of Excellence for HIV, and it says that within 2 business days, they will either come back with qualifying questions or they will approve it. So once you get approval from the BC Centre of Excellence of HIV, then PrEP medication is prescribed. So you have a prescription in your hand. Now, what you have to do is you take that prescription and you have to go to St. Paul's Hospital Ambulatory Pharmacy on Burrard Street. And it is the only place that you can get this prescription filled. That's for people who live here in the Greater Vancouver area. If you live outside of Vancouver, what your prescriber has to do, so let's say that I live in Terrace, BC, I go through the first 3 steps. My prescriber then has to get the prescription to St. Paul's. St. Paul's then fills the script, and what they then do is somehow mail it or ship it to the prescriber's office, the doctor's office. The doctor's office has to hold it. They then call the community member. The community member comes back to the doctor's office and they get their prescription. And so it's a lot more complex, and there's a lot more time that has to be put into this, and so you just have to know and plan and manage for those delays and times of getting the form filled, getting the pre-approval, then getting the script going down to St. Paul's, or getting the script mailed to your doctor's office, and your doctor's office becomes the dispensary. So pharmacies are out of the question. Now, again, if you're First Nations and Inuit and you live here in BC or anywhere else in Canada, once you have that script, you can go to any pharmacy and have that filled at this time. So in summary, PrEP is a medical prevention approach for people who do not have people who do not have HIV, but are at risk of infection through exposure or possible exposures, and again, those risk categories that we had talked about. Individuals take the specific medication on a daily basis to reduce the risk of HIV infections, either if exposed through possible exposure through sexual contact and or intravenous drug use. Here is this flyer, and I'll be more than happy to share this flyer. I have it saved as a JPEG, so you can post it to your Facebook and other social media channels. And I also have it saved as a PDF, and that's so that you can forward it to the community. And again, it's really simple messaging of daily PrEP to prevent HIV. If you are HIV negative and concerned about HIV, ask your doctor if PrEP is right for you. PrEP is a daily pill that can protect you from HIV. For BC's and First Nations and Inuit people wanting PrEP, simply see the doctor for a prescription and fill that prescription at no cost at any pharmacy. And again, Smart Sex Resource, search the word PrEP for more information and current information. This is changing. Here in BC, there was an expansion. So the Center of Excellence made the announcement on December 28th, and beginning January 1st, 2018, there has been universal coverage, or coverage for those individuals that have those risk categories for you to get PrEP. But again, for First Nations people, get the prescription, go to a pharmacy, and it is an intervention that is available here, now. Get on it! For more information, there's some great social media resources, and I just selected 2: PrEP Canada, Rethinking HIV Prevention, and then PrEP Facts, Rethinking HIV Prevention and Sex. They're 2 groups. Log on, and they're like community forums, but they're also informed and hosted by people that are experts within this field. Now, that said, I don't know whether or not they know about First Nations. So you have to inform yourself if you're First Nations, again, going back to what we had just talked about in this presentation. Other resources, the BC Centre for Disease Control's Smart Sex Resource is a phenomenal resource. It is updated, and we are constantly updating, so as things change and as we learn more, we update the Smart Sex Resource guide and the topics. The BC Centre for Excellence in HIV is another good resource. There is not much information that is specific for First Nations and Inuit people. So it's very general, it's for general population, but for our community, I think there needs to be a little bit more work done so that there's specific messaging and specific guidance for working with First Nations and Inuit people from the center. Because if you go there and you only read it, it only says for general population. And if you look at their guidance, you would have to fill out that form, you'd have to go to St. Paul's, and it doesn't say right now that there's a different process that's available for First Nations and Inuit people. So again, it is not inclusive for our community. KT is another great resource, and they have a lot of background information. That's where I got the notice of compliance. I didn't even know what a notice of compliance was. Get Prepped through HIM, Healthcare Initiative, and they have a dedicated page that is for First Nations and Inuit people for accessing PrEP. It's another great resource. The Sex You Want, PrEP information for gay and bi and MSM, men who have sex with men. It's a Toronto-based resource. And of course, you go to the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, and they have a lot US-based information, but it is the background information. They have lots of studies showing the efficacy, and if you have any concerns around side effects and all that other things, the US CDC has great resources for that, as well as Katie and these other resources. Well, discussion and questions, and I have to thank you so much. It does my heart so good to have so many people here to learn about PrEP and to know that this is a viable intervention that is available for here in BC, and that intervention is where I want to narrowly focus my conversation for First Nations and Inuit people, that you can get it. Get tested, get a script, go to any pharmacy. And that also holds true for all of Canada. It doesn't matter where you are in Canada, if you're First Nations and Inuit, you have access to this 100% at no cost intervention. So with that, Kinonas Kamitinan, thank you so much. Or how we say in Cree, hi hi. Kinonas Kamitinan is a formal thank you. Hi hi is just hey.
Alright, hey.
Hey. So what do gay horses eat? Hey, 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 hey.
Now will be the stand-up comedy.
So again, thank you so much, and Examaga.
Okay, well, thank you, Harlan. So I want to open up for discussion and questions. So please pop in any comments you might have or any questions you have into the chat box, and I'll relay them to Harlan. So I'll give you a moment to think about that.
So what did you think of the presentation?
Oh, well, I used to work in HIV/AIDS for several years, 15 years at the Chima program. But I've been a little, focused on other topics for the last while. So it's really interesting for me to catch up and hear what's available now. And I know, the treatment medications, and they're continually researching and evolving. So
yeah.
More prevention opportunities in that toolbox, like you mentioned. There's all these different avenues for prevention that the more we can have, the better.
Yeah. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I will share with you, because I was living in New York City, and because I was HIV negative, and I couldn't write big fat checks, struggling to make our rent, right, or our mortgage payment. And so what I did was I opted into an HIV vaccine study. And it was the Merck study. And I thought, this is how I can stand in solidarity. But I also wanted to make sure that Native people were participating in this HIV vaccine study, so that if it was, of course they canceled the study because the efficacy was not there. But I wanted to make sure that First Nations people was being tested in First Nations communities, so that they know the efficacy of that vaccine or that intervention. But they had to cancel and pull the plug on the Merck study. But there are other, I don't know whether or not they're in clinical trials. I know that microbicides, there are some clinical trials, and we must get people enrolled in those research who are First Nations and Inuit people and Métis people, so that we know how it's going to respond to our community.
So I'm not seeing any questions or comments yet. Let's keep it open for a few more minutes.
Yeah.
But also, wondering if folks might be interested to hear a little bit more about some of your upcoming trainings and programs that Chima has.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we just finished doing around the kitchen training, around the kitchen table training here in BC, and it was 5 teams, I believe, throughout the province, and they're teams of 4. And so how around the kitchen table works is that we get teams of 4 that are from communities, and we give them the skills of how to host conversations within their communities. And then you all might call that facilitation skills. We just call it holding space, right? Or holding conversations around the kitchen table. Then what we do is we provide a curriculum on, let's say, self-esteem, thank you. I was like thinking self-control. I was like, no, not self-control. Self-esteem, hepatitis, HIV, and other things. And then the curriculums, basically, the women can just read the curriculums and or they can host these conversations. And so right around the kitchen table, and they have the trust of the community, they then can host these conversations to educate the community so the community is more informed. What is unique about this program is that we take guidance and direction from the community. So if the community goes, we want to talk about attachment or sexual violence, we go, cool. And then we work with that community and develop a curriculum so that they can then host that conversation and they can do that work. So we don't roll in and say, this is what you have to talk about. Here are some possibilities of conversations that you may want to talk about, but if there's something that is impacting your community, feed it up to us. We will bring in the experts and we will develop a curriculum so that you can have an informed conversation, and then we develop that product and then we ship it back out to the community. So it's a wonderful resource for the community. Encouraging Strong Paths is the exact same concept, except that for the men, is that the men would like to have land-based skills training, compass navigation, shelter building, hunting, log cabin building, and then once we provide those teachings, then it opens up the possibility. So for our November ESP training, we talked about prostate screening, we talked about HIV, we talked about PrEP. And so the men are open to these other teachings about how to look after themselves, but how to look after their community, but not only how to be a better provider, hunter, or shelter building to like survive, but then how do they protect and survive themselves? And so what we do is we plant the information to them, and then they take that information back to their community.
And building those skills can build self-esteem too.
Right. And then for the Two-Spirit program, we're in the process right now of developing, and again, what we're doing is we're trying to convene a working group or a listening session or a consultation where we impart knowledge, again, but we want to hear from folks that are based outside of Vancouver. There'll be people from Vancouver at it. But we want to hear from the Two-Spirit community is how best can we host and how best can we do this work of this reclaiming and restoring our place of honor of our Two-Spirit people, our calling home of our Two-Spirit people. And then how do we support that work, and how do we support that cultivation of that leaders and increase the capacity within our Two-Spirit community across the province. And then how do we then embed that within ATKT and ESP? And to that end, in July, we're going to go to Haida, and the Haida Nation in Old Masset is actually going to be hosting an ATKT, ESP, and a Two-Spirit Health Conference. So the women are going to be in Old Masset, meeting around ATKT. The men will be meeting over in High Helen. I don't know. Something Ellen, okay? And then so they'll be meeting, we'll be meeting at the same time. The Two-Spirit people will be also meeting. Then on Friday, we join camps, and then we do a community celebration. The community is coming together. They want to do a crab bake. It's high season, so there'll be all this harvesting, and so the community is going to host all of us. And then we'll have a 2-day celebration.
Wow.
Yeah, super excited. Could you imagine Haida in July?
Yeah. In your kayak.
That's right.
So a couple of questions have come in. So do you know if nurse practitioners can prescribe PrEP, or does it have to be an MD?
I believe, but I will check into that, but it is my understanding that nurse practitioners may prescribe PrEP. Again, with the blood work, and again, they have to fill out that form if you're not First Nations or Inuit. But if you're First Nations and Inuit, you take that prescription and get it filled at any pharmacy at no cost. But I will get more information about that.
Okay. And is there an alternative medication available that works like PrEP?
So currently, the only thing that has been prescribed for PrEP is Truvada and or the generic equivalent, which is, no name Truvada, is the only thing that has been approved at this point right now. I believe that there are some other things that are in the works, but they're in trials and or they are in development.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? We'll wait a moment. Okay. Well, I'd really like to thank Harlan for so passionately presenting, and for all of you for joining us today. For the team that helped get the session together for today. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and hope you all have a great rest of the day and the week.
Yes, thank
again,
you so
Harlan.
much. Thank you.